Okay. Back in the saddle again. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Michael Markowsky. Welcome to my studio. Today we're going to recreate another painting by another one of my very, very favorite artists. This time they're all big favorites of mine, but today's artist is definitely one of maybe the top 10, I would say, of my all-time favorite artists. Today we're going to be looking at the work of David Milne, and specifically recreating this painting here, Pink Reflections, Bishop's Pond, from 1920. And this is very typical of the art that David Milne made and it became famous for, at least here in Canada. He also achieved a certain amount of recognition in the United States as well. But beyond that, he's fairly not that well known, although we'll talk about a recent exhibition that was in London, England, that went kind of poorly. I mean, he's been dead for 80 years now, but there was a recent exhibition in London that was not received so well by the critics, which is not surprising. I can see certain people looking at a painting like this and being like, yeah, I don't know about that. Kind of a strange style. That's why I love it. So I'll also let you know that there's another painting, which I'm not going to have time to do, and I love this painting of his as well, that was done the year before, based on some drawings and sketches that he did in England. I think he may have painted this when he was in England, but when he was a Canadian war artist during World War I. Anyway, we'll get all to that in a moment. Let's, I want to let you know that there is, just gotta block all this spam that comes in from the robots trolling my, okay, so, there is the original image as well as an outline that I did for both paintings, and they're in a Dropbox folder, which I'll show you here in a moment. So, if you click in, if you click the Dropbox link in the description below, you'll see this folder here, and in this folder there are literally over, 150 folders. And where are we? We're right near the bottom, at least right now. There's, if you're watching a year or two from now, there might be another 300 folders in here. But we're going to look down here at David Milne, and you'll see there's 6 files in here. There's the original images, and then there's the 2 outlines, a JPEG and a PDF version of them as well. While I've got the browser open here, I just want to let you know that there's a private Facebook group just for people like yourself. I encourage you to join the Facebook group, upload your version of today's painting to the Facebook group, or maybe something else that you're working on, something else, another painting that is based on a photograph or something that you've seen. And once a month I go through the Facebook group, I organize everything, and then I give some feedback to anyone who's put a picture up there to help improve their art, because after all, I think that's what most people are trying to do, is get better and better and better as we go, right? Got a map here. We're going to talk about David Milne and his biography shortly here. I just want to get the painting started, so I want to show you how to transfer this outline onto a canvas. Now, certainly you could easily draw this image onto the canvas so that you could replicate today's painting, but I do these outlines because they definitely save a little bit of time, and for some people that might find that quite challenging, I think the outline is a great way to kind of get around that problem. So I've pre-recorded this. I'm just going to play it, and I'm going to talk over top of it. So what you're looking at there is a 9x12 sized canvas board, and then I printed out the outline from the Dropbox folder onto just regular photocopy paper. You can use an inkjet, laserjet, photocopier, doesn't matter, they all do the same thing, because essentially you're just going to trace over those lines and use this carbon paper as a way of transferring those lines onto the canvas. Those of you that are old enough remember that carbon paper from when we used to go to use your credit card, and they used to put it in that machine and swipe left and right, and it made that big crunching sound, and then there would be an impression of your credit card. Same sort of thing. So you can see I've got that under there, and I'm just going to trace over these lines, and I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm just going to skip through it. And I do, let's say, maybe 80% of the lines. I even did a signature there. Maybe I won't keep it, I'm not sure. But at least I have it there. And then I'm going to tear the tape off. And once I've got that off, then... Oh, where did I put this whole time I'm chattering. Then you've got your outline transferred onto the canvas. And this you can save, you could recycle. I think they're great to have around because you may potentially want to use them to experiment with some color. And of course, if this doesn't turn out the way you want, then you can always go back, trace the outline again onto a new canvas board and try to second, third, fifth, 10th time until you get a little bit closer to what you like, right? So that's another way. You know, if we take out the whole drawing aspect of painting, then we're all working from the same composition, right? Of course, I did teach an entire 40-episode long free how to draw course here on YouTube. There's a link to it in the description below. You can watch it all. Some people have found it to be very helpful, so that's available to help you in your creative journey as well. So let's take a look at the painting and then just think about how we're going to match some of these colors. So this artwork, actually, let's let me see. I'm just gonna try to find so this is the original one. I usually try to load up the size and dimensions here, so because he did a lot of paintings on paper, like watercolor paintings on paper. Yeah, so watercolor over graphite. So it's in the National Gallery's collection. Watercolor over graphite on wove paper, 37 by 57 centimeters. So not that big of a painting. Maybe a little bit bigger than this. Like, you basically think of your regular, like a ruler that you might use to rule lines on a piece of paper. It's a little, maybe, I think basically about twice the size of this 9 by 12 sized canvas, right? Which, depending on how you think of it, is either very small or much larger. If you're used to painting on these small canvases, then something twice the size seems huge. If you're used to painting on big canvases, something like this or even the original might seem very, very small. Okay, so I'm also not in, I mean, this is the documentation of this painting that I've seen all over the internet, and I've seen this painting in person, but I can't remember if, this is the paper was sort of egg-shelled, slightly off-white color, or if it was white and it's subsequently aged and gone a little bit yellow, or just it was photographed kind of poorly and that's the color that results. I'm just going to assume that this is the actual colors, and I'm going to try to mix this kind of almost grayish peachy color as a foundational color for this painting. But before we even get there, I'm going to apply my normal approach here, which is to put some warm yellow onto the canvas. So if you're just joining me for the very first time, this is what I do almost every episode, is I put this warm yellow down. Now, I could put this warm yellow down and then the color I'm going to put over top of this down, but I'm also trying to be kind of consistent, because sometimes in older episodes what I would do is sort of change my process painting to painting to painting, and be very specific to each painting, and that is helpful, but it's also kind of confusing for a beginner artist if every single time I'm taking a different approach, which, you know, most artists do take a different approach than one another, but in the interest of making this whole series of classes as accessible as possible to as many different people, trying to keep some level of familiarity episode to episode, I think, is helpful. On the other hand, some people say, oh, you're just squeezing every single artwork through the same what would you call it, like sausage making machine. And so I would say kind of, yeah, a little bit, because there are other videos out there that are much more sophisticated by, you know, art historians and restorers who are really, really interested in the exact method and process of every artist, which I think are interesting for really advanced artists to kind of go and check out. But most people, at least my audience, is sort of coming here because they just like the image and they want to get something pretty similar to this done. And if it's a little bit different than the original, or we get to the same place, but we use a slightly different method, I think most people are like, yeah, okay, I'm pretty fine with that. So, trust me, I have spent way too much time thinking and writing about all of the different ways to go about things, and I'm more interested in getting a cool painting done as quickly as possible and helping other people do the same than really giving a technical walkthrough on how all these artists work. So I put this warm yellow down. Now I'm actually, usually this time I take a break and I go take a look at the artist's biography. I'm going to blow dry this, and then I'm going to mix the other color that I'm going to put down here so that that's nice and ready for when we actually are ready to start painting here. So you'll forgive me while I just use the blow dryer to speed this whole process. Boom, just like that. Painting's all ready. We've got our color on here. So let's just move. Should we do this? I will move this here. I'm going to get some paint on the palette because I'm going to mix a few different colors to get this off-white. So I might as well start putting the colors on my palette. And even though it's possible that I might not use all of the colors from my set here of 6 colors, I'm going to put them on the palette, even just a little bit of them to get started, and then we'll see. So, you know, if you're watching this episode long after it originally aired live, and remember, I'm doing this live, and you can see all of the mistakes in real time, and then how I fix mistakes in real time too, which is, you know, in all seriousness, I've had many people contact me and tell me that's some of the most helpful stuff, because sometimes artists, they find themselves backed into a corner and not sure exactly how to get out of that predicament. So here you can kind of watch a little bit about how I solve those problems. So since today's painting is relatively straightforward, I might just actually mix this foundational color right here on the palette, as opposed to, I think, right? Well, maybe, I don't know. Let me think about it. So I'm going to mix, however, the color that I want to use, and then I'll add the white, I think, separately here. So let's. I don't need to make too much of it, because I want to keep it pretty much like this off-white here. Or I'm just going to mix a color and then add it to the white. So what I see is kind of a peachy brown. So to get that peachy color, let's take some warm yellow. And again, we don't need a ton of it. We're just going to kind of slightly alter the white. So I'm going to take a lot of yellow, relatively, let's say maybe 50% yellow, 30% or even 40% red, and then just a little bit of blue. And these are all my warm colors: warm yellow, warm red, warm blue. And if you're wondering which of these colors, or what's the names of them, they're all written in the description below. Okay. Oops. What? So that's probably, maybe I'm going to put just a bit more red in there. So what we've got, and we'll see here, because I might need to modify this a little bit, is kind of an orangey brown. Now, when I put the white into it, that orange will go much more peachy, right? So you just have to kind of, I don't want it to go too brown. If I put more blue in it, it's going to go from kind of orange into a brown. So I just want to be careful not to jump too quickly in that direction. Now I've got all this paint on my brush. Now I want to make a very subtle version of this. So if I start mixing this into the white, the danger is that this color will be too dark too quickly. So I'm just going to take some of it off my brush. Just going to take my rag here. I'm not going to wash my brush, because I'm just going to get paint back on it, but I just wanted to get the majority of the paint off of my brush here. So let's take this white. Okay. So now I'm going to take a little bit of this paint. I don't need a lot. You can see I just take a tiny bit of it. And let's just mix it into here. Let's get a bit more. And let's just see. That's pretty close. Now I'm also going to add some matte medium. I was like, where is my matte medium? I remembered it's sitting on the J. DeFeo painting, still drying. That painting has been drying for over a week now. So I'm just going to add matte medium to this color, and I'm putting a bunch of it in there so it goes kind of transparent. Maybe that was a lot. That's a lot, so I'm going to put a bit of white back in here. It's kind of an awkward thing to be mixing it in such a small little thing here, but that's okay. So the reason I put some matte medium is it's going to make it a little bit thinner and a little bit more transparent. I could add glazing fluid or slow dry medium, both of which will also thin the paint slightly. But there's no, both of those, glazing fluid and slow dry medium, slow the drying time down, and I don't really have a need for that to happen. I'm just going to cover this canvas with this same paint. So, and I want it to dry actually relatively quickly. So matte medium is exact. It literally is paint without any color in it. It's the same clear paint that is in all, well, it's in a different brand, so it's not exactly the same, but it's probably chemically very, very similar. I'm going to go back to my larger brush here. I'm a little bit worried there might be a lot of white in here, so maybe I'm just gonna... It's always easier to do 2 coats of paint that are a little bit thinner than it is to do one really thick coat and then realize, oh, that was a little bit too opaque. Now I gotta wipe some off, or... Excuse me. Okay. So this is going to obscure a little bit of the image that was there originally. I have to work a little bit quicker. I mean, slow dry medium and glazing fluid do slow down the drying time. Matte medium does not. And so it might dry kind of quickly. So because we're kind of trying to spread this out, we want to make sure we're doing that spreading out in kind of good time, because otherwise it starts to get kind of sticky and doesn't work as kind of well. So that's pretty good. There's a little bit of the yellow showing through in places, but you know, if we look at them side by side, I think that's pretty close, right? Now, as this dries, it's likely to get a little bit more transparent, and a bit more of that yellow will come through. So it's just sort of up to you to decide, like, you know, we could blow, in fact, let's blow dry it right now, and then we can kind of decide, is my background dark enough, or not dark enough? Have I covered enough of the yellow to feel satisfied, or do I need to mix another layer here? So let's just take a quick blow dry here and then see what happens. Okay. So I think we could continue going. Let me just take a look at the original. So it does, now I've got a bit more of that yellow coming through. Now I'm going to be painting on top of a lot of this. So some of that yellow that looks a little bit patchy and coming through will probably not be as visible later on as it is now. So the question that you would ask yourself is, does it matter, right? Is it at this point, is it is that, can I live with it or not? I think I can live with this. It doesn't bother me. I certainly have never been bothered by a little bit. I mean, I like that effect, in fact. I could see some people saying, yeah, it feels a little bit too thin or patchy, so I'm going to do another layer. So if I was to do another layer of it, which I'm not going to do, I would just do the same thing again, but probably putting half as much white in, or maybe even less, like maybe 3 or 4 to 1 matte medium to white. And I'd also be careful about putting too much more of the color that we mixed in there. I think that's good for me, for my purpose. And I could see also some people saying, well, why not just mix that color and paint this color on top of the white canvas? Why put the yellow down and then this color? And that's a good question. I have done just that many times, but there is a difference. The difference is super, super subtle, but there is a difference. What we're doing here is a little bit more of a traditional, I mean, essentially this is painted on paper, right? So we're trying to recreate a little bit of the effect of paper, but it's also a very traditional way of working, of building up layers of colored paint. And I really like the effect of having a color that's being obscured, rather than trying to make that color, mix that color all at once into one single layer. I think the difference would be between, let's say, you were making a sandwich and you put lettuce and tomato and let's just say lettuce and tomato on top of a hamburger or something, right? That's the difference between doing that versus getting a blender and putting your tomato and lettuce together and making some sort of like blended paste of tomato and lettuce, which sounds kind of gross. But effectively, one might say, if you were to put a blindfold on and eat it, the taste might be very, very similar, if not identical, but the texture would be a little bit off, right? So it's the same. I'm just thinking of this analogy off the top of my head. I think it's very similar in the sense that we get to pretty much the same place, but it's different, right? Or for many people, the effect will be almost indistinguishable, but it will still be distinguishable. All right, and so there's nothing wrong with doing it all at once. Just as there's nothing wrong with blending lettuce and tomato together to put on your sandwich. I mean, who knows? Maybe I just came up with the recipe of tomorrow, and maybe there's 5 years from now, people will go back to this video and be like, that was when he changed the world with the lettuce and tomato, blended lettuce and tomato. Stranger things have happened. Okay, so I think I'm just going to let that dry, and let's talk about David Milne here and his biography. And I want to show, there's some links I want to show. I want to kind of show a little bit about literally where he lived, etc. Pascal in the comments says, I'm hungry now. Well, he says, I think there might be something wrong with the blended lettuce and tomato. Yeah, pureed lettuce and tomato sandwich. Ugh. Okay, so David Milne, born 1882 and dies in 1953. So at age 71, he passes away. For an artist, that might be even considered a little bit young. There's many artists that live a lot longer. I think artists, you know, doing art late in life is a great way to extend your life, right? It keeps the mind nice and nimble. Anyway, so he's the last of 10 children, right? So he's got 9 brothers and sisters, and which is very similar to a number of the other famous Canadian artists born in and around this time, including Tom Thomson. Tom Thomson, I think he was the middle child of, I think, 8 children. So he had like 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters, and then some younger brothers and sisters. Another Canadian artist, A.Y. Jackson, had, I think, 4 older brothers and sisters. So, you know, 100 years ago, it was not uncommon for people to have large families, because often children would die young or during childbirth, etc. So it's sort of pretty typical. His parents were Scottish, so they were recently immigrated to Canada, and what I think, and so so here's a map of, you know, here's New York City, which we'll talk about here shortly. Here's Toronto, Montreal, and if you're familiar at all with this area here, southern Ontario, you know, we have Toronto again right here. Owen Sound, which is where Tom Thomson grew up, which is, he was familiar to anyone watching who's from Canada. So this is, we call like cottage country up here, which is where a lot of people in Toronto, you know, during the summer, they drive up here to Owen Sound, Collingwood area, and also in this area, there's also some beautiful homes along, there's this Lake Huron, right? Yeah. So this is, you know, in the area, Burgoyne, Ontario, where David Milne is born. And what I think is interesting is, you know, he grows up in a very small community, very small town, 9 brothers and sisters. And, you know, I think anyone who grows up in that area, you either kind of love it or you hate it, right? After he finishes school, he becomes a teacher himself and sort of travels around that area, around Ontario, teaching, and also taking correspondence classes at night, art classes. And so he basically teaches himself a lot of the foundational skills to become an artist. And then, you know, sends sort of a Hail Mary out there into the world and gets accepted into the Art Student League in New York City, which couldn't be more of a different place to be than being in sort of southern Ontario 120 years ago. So he moves to New York City at the age of 21, which I think if you can imagine going from a town of maybe 100, 200 people, you know, large family, large, you know, like mostly farming communities, and going to New York City in 1903, that must have been quite the shock. And he's quite successful when he gets to New York, and he ends up exhibiting, one of only 2 Canadian artists who exhibit in the Armory Show. And we've talked about the Armory Show a few times. The Armory Show is arguably the single most important art exhibition in the history of North America. I would defy anyone to present to me a more important art show. Because the Armory show, the reason why it's so important is it's really the first time that a lot of the most famous artists, young artists, Matisse, Picasso, Malevich, trying to think of all of the Marcel Duchamp, all of the major European artists, the very first time they exhibit anywhere in North America. There were small little private exhibitions and private galleries, but this is a big exhibition in a big kind of like warehouse space. And there's two parts of this exhibition. There's one side that is dedicated to all these European artists, and there's another side that's dedicated to all the North American artists, mostly American artists. And as I said, there's only two Canadian artists, one of which is David Milne. And that is, it is like a bomb going off in the North American art world. It shocks everyone because they had never really, they'd maybe heard of things like cubism and fauvism, but they had never really, most of them had never seen any of this art themselves. So there are huge lineups. It's in all of the newspapers, very controversial, particularly because of an artwork by Marcel Duchamp, a few of them. But I think it says something. It's pretty incredible that David Milne is in this show. It's sort of like he's in the absolute right place at the right time, at ground zero for this explosion of art in North America. And that I mean, and again, that exhibition, all of a sudden, all these artists American artists are seeing what's happening in Europe, and within a very short time, everyone starts playing around with cubism and fauvism, and it's just, yeah. Anyway, so he's in that show, and despite the fact that he's included in this exhibition, it helps him sell some work, and he has some lifelong notoriety because of that. But ultimately, he still is kind of struggling to find his way and to make a name for himself. So let's kind of just back out here. So he moves to New York, right? And the Art Student League, which I've been to, was, this very important, kind of less like a school than like a bunch of studios. There were some classes there, obviously, but mostly it was sort of like a hangout spot, more like a club than anything, where artists would gather and meet informally and sometimes much more formally. And pretty much the who's who of artists around this time period, the turn of 1920s, 1915, pre-World War I era, all passed through the Art Students League. And that continues on until and through World War II as well. But anyway, he's there for about, I think, 6 years. I think he's in New York City proper. And then afterwards leaves and goes to Boston Corners, which is kind of this very small, upstate New York. I don't know if it's considered upstate. I mean, it's more upstate New York than New York City. Kind of towards, the Catskills here and Albany and what Utica's over here. Kind of right on the border here of Connecticut and Massachusetts here, right in this little area. So it's similar to the area and landscape that he grew up in, right? So he has this time in New York City, and it's pretty exciting. He's 21 years old when he goes there, and then by the time he's like 27, 28, he's like, yeah, I don't know, I'm kind of like, I want to get outside. I really like the landscape and the fresh air. And he also gets married at this time, and he I think the major thing that happens kind of right after that period of time is he enlists in World War I, right? So Canada gets involved in World War I a couple years before the United States does. The United States comes into the war late, as they do again in World War II. So he's I don't know if he was drafted or he enlisted, volunteered. A lot of artists at the outset of the war, artists and civilians, artists are also civilians, but a lot of men who, you know, and very young men, right? Often people forging their birth certificates so that they could go to war, which sounds kind of crazy now, but so he trains and he goes off to England, and just as he's about to actually go to France to fight in World War I, the war ends, which, you know, I'm sure he was probably quite disappointed by at the time. There were a lot of like young people who were really excited by the opportunity to go to war. He didn't get a chance to actually fight in the war, which, you know, I think we're all quite lucky that that he wasn't sent into that giant meat grinder that was World War I. But he does get accepted into this very new organization program that started called the War Artist Program by Lord Beaverbrook. Lord Beaverbrook is this famous Canadian, you know, businessman, socialite kind of figure who sponsors this program to get artists that were in the Canadian military to document the war. And many of the early members of the Group of Seven were also part of the War Artist Program. So even though David Milne doesn't fight, he's sent around France and Belgium to go make paintings of the battlefield. And you know, the World War I battlefields were, I mean, some of the most horrible places that the mind can possibly imagine. And even, you know, a year or two after the war ended, there was still pulling bodies out of the muck. They were still finding live ammunition. I mean, they still find live ammunition, live cannon shells, and mines that have not yet exploded all over from World War I. 100 years plus later, they're still finding explosives, and people still die every year from stepping on landmines from World War I. So anyway, he's going and documenting that, and we've seen a number of other artists who are doing the same sort of thing. Remember, we did a painting here by Mary Ritter Hamilton, right? And she did the exact same thing after World War I. She also went around painting the battlefields, although she was not technically a part of the War Artist Program because she was a woman, right? Let's see, what else do I want to just mention? So after World War I, he returns back to Boston Corners. He lives with his wife, but the relationship sort of falls apart, and he moves back to Canada after World War I, and he goes... he kind of moves around a little bit, but this is one of the places, Severn, and he lives there. He goes up to right up here, Tamagami to paint, as well as Algonquin Park to paint, right? So these kind of provincial parks. I'm not even sure if Tagami was a park at that time yet. But again, he's going into the wilderness and painting, just like many of the members of the Group of Seven. David Milne was not a member of the Group of Seven. I don't really know the relationship between... I'm sure they would have known about one another. But David Milne, his work was very different than the other Group of Seven members. Very, you know, he had his very iconic style, which we'll take a look at here, which is why one of the reasons why I love his work so much. So let's just sort of take a look at some of his paintings that he's making around the 1920s and 30s. So unfortunately, there's not a wiki art page for David Milne. I'm not sure why. I think there's a lot of his work out there. Somebody should build that. But you could see, like, here's one of his World War I paintings. You know, some of the main features of his work are these very, one might even say, like, unfinished kind of look. The look of, like, an underpainting, where we see a lot of exposed canvas or paper that hasn't been painted on or touched at all. And then he uses this dry brush technique, which we're going to experiment with here shortly. And that dry brush technique, you know, is... I'm not sure where he learned that technique. To me, it looks a lot like the kind of stuff that we see in Chinese and Japanese and Korean art, right? And so I don't know if that was where he got inspired, or, I mean, he certainly didn't travel there, but he would have been aware of some of those works. Some of those works would have been included in some of the museums in New York City, especially when he was there. But he also experimented with etching, with printmaking, when he was in Boston Corners. One of his patrons gave him an etching set and a press, a small press that he could make his own etchings. And dry point is a kind of etching where you're sort of just kind of carving into the surface of a plate, and then you can ink it up and then print with it. And I imagine, you know, he's experimenting with printmaking and to make those etchings while doing watercolors, and everything is sort of colliding at the same time. So you have some of the work that he was doing prior, which is a lot more impressionist kind of, I guess, style. It reminds me a lot of Stuart Davis's. You know, we looked at Stuart Davis just a few weeks ago. Now, you're like, what? Stuart Davis was making a lot of the same kind of work that David Milne was making around the same time. Later on, this is where Stuart Davis goes into much more kind of this kind of cubist kind of form, while on the other hand, David Milne goes in a different direction. So you can see this is kind of, I guess you'd say that's kind of like an intersection between those two artists. And when I think of, like, you know, Stuart Davis was this kind of American artist that didn't fit into any box. I think David Milne is the Canadian version of an artist like that. An artist that is kind of doesn't fit in anywhere. It looks very different than anything else going on at the time. What else do I want to show really quickly? You know what? Let's get right into the painting. And we'll talk about a little bit more about some of the stories surrounding his biography there. So, how should we begin here? One of the things that I love about his art, and there's a couple of great rooms. If you're ever in Toronto, you got to go to the Art Gallery of Ontario, the AGO. They have really one of the best art collections in all of Canada, arguably better than the National Gallery in Ottawa. But they have at least 2 rooms dedicated to David Milne, and they also have a room kind of off on the corner near the basement that has like his archive, and they have all these kind of drawers and sliding things where you could see his his sketchbooks and all that kind of stuff. So it's really the main repository for David Milne's art. But there's a quality to his work. Again, I completely understand why some people may not like David Milne's art, because there's some of the colors look kind of drab. There's a lot of empty space. They do kind of have this slightly unfinished quality to them. Like if we zoom in on this painting, you know, you could see, you know, if you were to like, let's say, scrape all the paint off that was applied on here, there might be maybe 10% of the canvas, or in this case paper, actually covered with paint, and the rest is sort of spread out, or there's big gaps between it. Now, I know some people would look at this and be like, yeah, ugh, just looks really sloppy. Looks like my kid could do this kind of stuff. Personally, I love this because I think, and as we will see today when we start trying to paint something like this, it is really hard to, it's not hard to paint this, but it's hard to resist the urge to paint everything in and to make solid shapes, because the compulsion is to want to fill the paper up, leave nothing blank. And David Milne, like the level of restraint that he shows in order to make a painting like this, I think is Herculean. Like, and so it's going to be interesting to see how people do here, because a lot of people are going to have much thicker paintings than David Milne actually used to do this. So the next question is, what is the first step? Now, I think he painted with black to begin with, and he's one of the rare artists that did use black as a main part of his palette. We could mix our own black. In fact, I might even mix my own black, just so, again, because it's good for people to see how that's done, because some people are like, what? You're gonna mix? How do you mix black? That sounds crazy. We can see here pencil lines underneath, so we know that he's sort of working in a similar way to what we have here, where we've got pencil, or in this case our carbon paper lines, and then he's painting over it with this dry black brush. And often a brush, you can see that, I don't know if he like taped two brushes together or trimmed a brush to get this particular kind of a look. So I don't know, how should we do this? Part of me wants to really chop up a brush here. I think I'm going to sacrifice a brush and then maybe try painting with a couple of brushes here. I mean, we could do, because he has this particular kind of a look that looks like two brushes side by side. Let me think about it. So let's mix this color to begin with. I'm going to mix my own black because I think knowing how to do this is important. Where should we? I'm going to do it right here because that's going to be dry already. Taking my warm red and my cool blue together. Take a bit more cool blue. I think that was too much cool blue. I think I'll paint with this. Now I'm going to take some cool yellow. And then I might go and add some actual black afterwards at the very end. That way I can have a little bit of nuance here between this color. So right now that's very purpley brown, which tells me that there's a lot of red and yellow, but not as much blue. So even though I thought I had too much before, let's add more cool blue to this mixture. There we go. Basically what we're doing is just killing off all the saturation, just making a very dead color. Let's get even more yellow in here. That's not bad. It's still a little bit on the brown side, and I could get a little bit more blue out here. But I think for our initial lines, that's going to be more than fine. Okay. So let's try doing a few different things here. So I'm going to take a couple of paint brushes. Let's get something a little bit darker under here. So remember, this is a paintbrush on here on the right that sat in the water overnight, and so that's kind of frustrating. But you know what? We can kind of play around with it. Let's see if we can get. It's a little bit too wide. I don't want them right close together. I want them kind of almost overlapping. Let's see. I don't know if this is nuts. I haven't really spent too much time thinking about it, so we'll experiment. So if I just dip this paint in right now, it's going to be maybe a little bit too wet. So in fact, I'll just take, here's my brush. Let's go to, so the reason I'm just zooming in on this area is because there's some dark areas, so I know I can experiment in this area. Not bad. But that's coming off really thick, right? So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a rag. I'm going to wipe some of this paint off. So that I get a dry brush. You can see it's still kind of a bit, this color's kind of purpley. I don't mind that. Another thing you can do is just take the brush and just wipe it onto your fingers or the back of your hand. I think I need to put a little bit more yellow in this color. It looks still too purpley. That works pretty well, and you can see it's also going on very dry. Okay, so that works pretty well. I like how that works. I'm just actually going to let these brushes sit out and dry even a little bit. So I'm not, usually I don't want that to happen, but I don't mind them getting a little bit crusty, because that's kind of a bit of David Milne's style, right? So just like when you hear, like, there's literally an artist out there for everyone. Different artist who does different kinds of things, who kind of breaks the rules in different ways. So I'm going to now just experiment. I'm going to take this other brush and let's kind of customize it here. Just make sure I'm in an area you can see. So this is an old brush that I've had here that sort of is not the best brush anymore. So I'm carving you can see how, like, it pops off, right? So this is, I'm not this brush probably cost $1 anyway. So anyone who's horrified by that, this brush is on its last legs anyway. I just use it as almost like a palette knife to mix. So let's just see how well this one works, and maybe I need to customize it a little bit more. Right, so I've just got a bunch of paint on there now. It looks like it's lost some of my special customization, but if we brush some of the paint off, let's just sort of So, you know, I'm sure if I worked at this, I'd be able to develop a foolproof method to doing it. I think I'm gonna try to trim that even more. I don't know about this. I am definitely ending the lifespan of this brush. Okay, let's try this again. Right, it is like, it takes a lot of restraint just to allow a brush stroke like these to just exist on the canvas and to not go in and try to fill them all out. And so just, I think this shape right here is this one right here. Let's see, maybe I'm going to go back to these other brushes that I made before. This one seems to kind of work a little bit more reliably, I think, my taped brushes. Now you notice there's not double lines everywhere either. He only uses them in certain places, but just for our sake, I'm just going to continue with this. Let's go down. I'm going to do a little bit more of this, and then I think what I'll ultimately end up doing after I've got these basic lines on here is to I think I'll paint some of these lines back with black later on. But I don't mind how this has turned out so far, so. I mean, the big thing is just restraint. Now, did he tape paintbrushes together? Maybe. I think he was probably just using brushes that he had that were almost basically just useless brushes, like discarded brushes, or that other artists would discard. Because, you know, when brushes get older, they often start to do this exact kind of thing. They kind of become a little bit useless. And they kind of split. They don't kind of form nice points anymore. And I don't know if he did it deliberately or you know, I would probably imagine like a lot of artists, you know, just kind of playing around, experimenting, and then was like, you know what? This is kind of cool. I like the way these lines look. Like, huh, maybe there's some interesting potential here. When I see these, his marks remind me of, like, it has a little bit of a slightly out of focus, like misregistered kind of quality that looks, it reminds me of sort of looking out a window in winter, and you know, things aren't, maybe there's frost on the window and things are a little bit unclear and blurry, and I mean, right now, doesn't it look like it's the camera's out of focus? Maybe it is, but let's just double check. Well, it's pretty much in focus. Now that area has got a little bit more of that purple, that, whereas the rest of it is a little bit darker. Does that drive me crazy? Let's see if we look here. It doesn't drive me crazy. And so some people, their instinct might be like, well, okay, I gotta paint over all this very carefully so it looks like this. You know what? We're going to be covering a lot of this with paint anyway. So what might look like, you know, a radically different area in here, by the end of the painting, we may not even notice that purple. So I'm just going to let it hang out on its own, right like that. Okay. So let's I've even though there's more lines on here, again, I'm probably going to do a little bit more of that with black later on. So I'm just going to, I think I'm going to, well, yeah, let's give this a little bit of a clean. There are lots of comments in here. So I'm just going to keep moving forward there. I wonder what color we should go to next. I think I'm going to continue probably doing the rest of the painting with this weird brush system that I've just taped together here, because I like the effect it's getting. And there are parts of the painting, well, I was going to say, are there parts of the painting where we got the same sort of thing in color, or is it just the black lines? I do see it with the yellow a little bit. Looks like that in the red. Like, I'd be willing to bet that he's using, his brushes are, I bet he's using like some cheap straw brushes. Like, these brushes, these are some like real cheap brushes. I guess they're Winsor & Newton, but they're still probably like, must have got these for like $5 or $6 that I've used for painting big murals and stuff. So the quality, you don't really need a really nice brush to paint on a rough surface, because the rough surface, like a brick, is just going to destroy your brush anyway. But these, I think this is, I don't know if these are synthetic or if this is like a hay. I think, hard to tell. But these types of bristles, like a hay, which is not uncommon, basically, you know, they get really stiff. I would, in fact, I would almost bet you that he painted with a brush like this, not the same size, but with these same types of really coarse bristles, because the ones that I'm using are a little bit more flexible and don't quite drag and scrape the paint in the same way as his. Just I thought I'd mention that off. Okay, let's go to the red. Let's go to some warm, looks like a warm red on here. All right, so I'm going to take my warm red. Now, that, if I paint this warm red right now, I think it's going to be just a little bit too much. So I'm going to modify it with a little bit of my dark color here. I don't want to put... Actually, even before I do that, let's just see what it will look like if I put a bit of my cool yellow in here. A little bit of magenta, because that's going to take away some of the intensity of that color. Still think it needs to be a bit darker. It's got to get rid of a little, take some of that magenta down in terms of its proportion. So now what I'm getting a little bit closer to, you know, a bit more of a crimson-y red, probably like a carmine red, which is just a little bit different. Like, it's not quite the bright red right out of the tube. It's being modified a little bit because again, if you think we paint this right on this surface, the kind of the white and yellow of the background is going to be mixing in with our, like, optically mixing in with the color. So that warm red on its own on this color will end up making that color look kind of pink, even though the colors aren't mixing. But we're painting on a white surface, it's going to look a little bit brighter than it actually was. I don't want that, right? I want it to be a little bit darker, so I'm making the color a little bit darker, and then when I apply it here, it's going to look lighter. Okay, so let's zoom back in. Okay. Same sort of thing, right? I got my brush in here. I don't want it to be just soaking wet with paint. I want it to be kind of dry. So I can just dry a little bit of it off on the palette. And then when I go back in, I'll just kind of drag a little bit of this paint that's even already drying out a little bit. You know? So just dip back into that paint that's kind of dry, and for many people would consider it just completely useless. All of those people who say they have difficulty with their paintings sort of being the paint on the palette drying too quickly. Here's a painting where that doesn't matter. So you can see even here, this color still to me looks a little bit too bright. I mean, I could darken it even more. Whereas when I look at it here, it's like, oh, that's, I don't know, it's a little bit dark. So let's even just take a bit more of our dark color in here. There you go, that's a little bit closer to what I wanted. go right to the edge of that canvas there, just so you see that's where I am. Right, see that purple starting to kind of disappear into the color that we've got on there. Let's see, just a little bit more red. Is that all the red in here? Okay. That's pretty good for right now. So, again, I'm just going to clean my brush off. Wow, lots of, so many comments in there. I don't know if I can keep up. Maybe at the very end I'll kind of go through them a little bit there, but that's awesome. I probably, maybe a smarter idea would have been to use an elastic band. I was thinking about, let's get an elastic here. Or a clip? No, let's get an elastic. It's just that this tape, once it starts getting wet, my only fear is that water is going to get trapped in there. Let's see. Let's wait till that problem happens, which is the famous last words, right? Ollie says, my paint does dry very fast, so I wonder if I store it somewhere too warm, as it's sometimes almost drying as soon as it's out of the tube. Any tips for storing tubes of paint? Just out, you know, in a relatively, like a colder than room temperature, I would say, a little bit. Like maybe 17 degrees Celsius, out of the sun. That should be okay. I would not keep it in the fridge, no. How do I store my paints? I just store them in a shoebox here in my studio, which is in the basement. It's kind of cold down here. But I mean, I've taken acrylic paints camping and painted with them. I don't know why your paints seem to be drying faster. That's why I just use a little bit, put more paint on as I need it. I mean, worst comes to worst, you can use slow dry medium if you're finding it's drying really too quickly. Slow dry medium slows the drying time down. I was using a lot more of that during the summer months here in my paintings. just because the paints were drying faster than I wanted. Now that things have gotten a little bit warmer or cooler, I don't need it really at all, because when it's colder, paints dry a little bit slower. If you're outside in the bright sun, your paint is going to dry very fast, right? It's within minutes your acrylic painting, the palette, all of that will be starting to get a little skin over top of it. In the winter, you can paint with acrylic paints and it should take much longer to dry. I mean, storing your paint, yeah, as long as it's not like sitting in the hot sun, they should be pretty. I don't think your problem would be the paint in the tube, unless the tubes aren't quite closed well enough. Okay, what should we do next? Let's do this kind of what color? Greenish yellow, mustard kind of, I would say that is. So that mustardy color, you know, I think what I would say that I'm quite confident this would be if we just add a little bit of blue to it. And we have to be very careful. Like when I say a little bit, I'm talking a little bit. Otherwise it's going to go green. We just want to keep it right on, like that's, I think, pretty close. If anything, I'm going to take just, again, a little bit of red to kind of counterbalance too much greenish color. Again, I don't want to go too far, otherwise this is going to go brown or green. That's pretty good. I think that's pretty close to the original. So let's zoom back in. So here's my horizon line right here. That's this line down here. So maybe I'll just move it down. We're pretty close. Now I don't know if he did the whole painting this way, with these kind of the way I've got these brushes tied up, but you know, I'm just going to kind of continue playing with it this like this for right now. So right now that yellow goes on and it seems really bright. It's possible that it's brighter, but it's also we don't see all the darker colors in here yet. So I'm gonna err on the side of caution before I go too, because it's gonna be much easier for me to darken these colors than it would be to lighten them. Because we're basically sort of painting like a watercolor painting at this moment. And with watercolor, you can always get darker. Lightening it up, though, that's... you're kind of out of luck. So I'm going to put a bunch of these in here, and then we're going to get darker, and I'll probably use this same yellow again, and I might darken this yellow a little bit. Okay. Okay, looks like these brushes are slipping and that tape is losing its hold, so lasted longer than I thought. Oh, it just comes right off. Okay. Yeah, let's clean these brushes better. Wow, it almost gives me like makes my eyes a little bit cross trying to look at that because of I keep seeing kind of double, right? Okay, let's clean up a little bit here. So the next thing that I see is this looks like cool blue. Then we got a purple. Let's do the cool blue first. And this time I think I'm just going to use one brush. But this is, again, this is the brush that was kind of not so happy with me, and it's kind of lost its shape. So let's take some white, and though this white's got a little bit dirty, that's okay. Take my cold blue. Mixing not that bright cold blue that we see on the bottom down there. Okay, and then so then I kind of wipe it off, right? So that it's going to be very dry. You know, some people will like detest this type of thing because it's like, I don't have any control. I don't, like, it's hard to know. Like sometimes I get it, think it's going to be dry, and it makes a darker line than I expected. that's kind of the point. The point of using this dry brush is that it does make for a little bit of unexpected results, which drives some people crazy, and for some people they absolutely love it. They love kind of the little bit of the unexpected chance quality of painting with dry brush. Because it's a surprise. It's a surprise for the artist. Sometimes artists, what they like about making art is losing a little bit of control, right? We always think of like artists as wanting to be in control and having full mastery over the tools. This is a little bit different. Like, now certainly David Milne had mastery over his tools. He was using, at first, for me, I don't feel very like I have much mastery over this particular tool. But if I was to try using this tool every day for the next couple of years, even with those two brushes painted together, I could probably do a photorealist painting with brushes that were chopped up and not being used, being taken care of properly. It just would take a little bit of time to master that tool. But it just has a unique kind of, like, what's another, like I've collaborated with a lot of musicians over the years, and one of the things, I've known musicians who, let's say have an old guitar that is kind of broken, but they love the sound of it, or it only has 2 or 3 strings on the guitar, or the guitar is slightly out of tune, or it has a rattle or a twang to it that would otherwise make it, a garbage, scrap heap, garage sale item. But they're like, it just has this quality that I can't get anywhere else. And I think that's sort of how he saw some of his brushes, is that, probably somebody gave him new brushes for Christmas once, and he was like, thanks, no thanks. I know. They're like, what? But your brushes are all old, and they're falling apart, and there's hairs coming off them. And why would... And he's like, yeah, that's what I like about them. I like them in this particularly kind of state, because I can't get them out of these new brushes. I basically have to take the new brushes you spend all this money on, leave them outside for a winter or two, let them kind of fall apart, dry in the sun, and freeze and dry to get to the point they're at right now. So whereas I can just find old brushes somebody threw out and reclaim them, and I'll get the exact technique I want. Okay. Pascal, some of these seem to have a Gauguin vibe, others a Matisse vibe. He was around during their time, met them, I think. I don't know if I don't know if I'm reading the right comments here. Maybe you guys have had a whole other conversation. I don't think, Pascal, that he would have met Matisse or Picasso. I could be totally wrong. I just highly doubt. Neither Picasso nor Matisse came to New York for the Armory show. They didn't come until a little bit later on. So, David Milne was a bit of like a kind of a loner type of person, right? He's making art that's unlike the art that anybody else is making, and he's living often in the countryside. So unless he would have met them, at one of his own exhibitions when he came into Toronto or Montreal or New York for an exhibition of his own, I think it would be really unlikely that he met or really had much of a relationship with other artists. He was making different art than everybody else. He had a different kind of temperament and personality. So I don't know, somebody, maybe there's a whole book or something talking about him meeting some of those other artists, but I would be very surprised. So let's look at, let's mix this darker color. Should we go there? Because this, how do we get that? That's, I think that color, let me just get a bigger brush to mix it. Just gonna zoom in. This darker color, I'm pretty sure is a cool blue. I need some, well, you know, I was gonna just, I wonder, can we use some of this warm yellow in here? Just see what effect, because we basically want a dark teal color. Normally I would mix this with cool yellow. I'll take also my dark color and mix this in here. That's pretty close. So let's try that. I'm just going to use one brush for a little while here. And this again is a brush that's kind of chewed up. So right there in the bottom left corner of the painting. And I think I'm also going to try painting with my hand a little bit further back on the paintbrush. You know, so that a little bit more like the way Matisse painted, almost just kind of holding it in between two fingers like this, so that, again, I get a little bit looser of a brush stroke. It's a bit of a brighter color than his, right? If I wanted to get a little bit darker, I'll just take a little bit more of my dark color again. But I kind of, as you know, I kind of like a little bit brighter colors anyway. I always just think, like, we can get more and more subtlety just by making things a little bit darker, glazing with them. It's much easier to begin kind of a little bit loud and turn the volume down later than it is to try to start, you know, kind of quiet and then amp it up. A little bit more of this over here. Looks like he did mix a bit of this maybe into his black. So we'll just kind of come back to that, I think, later. But this is in the reflection. Any more? Looks like I see a bit more of it. Just a few little brush strokes. Looks like that's it. Let's zoom back out. So, where should we go now? To the green, I guess, right? And that green... What is that green? That looks... I bet you that that is a cobalt blue, which is a blue that's in between our warm and cool blues. So it's a bit more of a neutral blue, and cold yellow, so that it's almost a little bit of a grassy green than we get when we mix the warm blue and the warm yellow. And it's also got a bit of that lime color than we mix the cold blue and the cold yellow together. But we can experiment here and just see what we get. Let's put a little bit more cold blue. The cold yellow is going to make for a little bit more of an intense kind of color. It's going to be just a little bit brighter. So let's start out, let's take some of the cool blue and the cool yellow together, and we're going to get this really bright green. Which is nice, but it's too much for this painting. It's just too candy color. So let's take a bit of warm blue, and we're going to mix this in here. And that warm blue is going to kill some of the intensity of that paint and give it a bit more of a... In fact, let's even take a bit of the warm yellow and put this in here. So we basically have got both of our blues and both of our yellows in this one paint. And I think I'm pretty close. So we'll see when we start painting with it. Paula says a fan brush might help. You could, like, where's my fan brushes? So what Paula's talking about is using a fan brush. So here's some fan brushes. These are right out, this is the kind of thing that Bob Ross used all the time, the fan brush. He used these to get the, like, trees. He used these a lot for bushes and trees because they can get this kind of stippling kind of quality. You could, but you'd really only be able to use like a little bit of it. I mean, you could try. You know, this is a old fan brush, so it's definitely seen much brighter days, so I could cut into it. But I think it'd be using a really big brush, like, unless you had a much smaller fan brush, and they do make small fan brushes. I'm just going to continue here. So that green is still too intense. So I'm going to take my dark color and I'm going to mix that into here. Now look at that. I got kind of much more of like a racing green. That's cool. I like that color a lot. So maybe more so than any other color except maybe the yellow, this green feels like it's adding a lot more structure to the painting. And so I'm being a little bit more mindful as to how I'm putting this in here. You really have to, it's hard to, like, I kind of want to just keep building up, but I got to make sure I leave some of the paper or the canvas exposed, right? And not just to launch right into just covering things up like an impressionist painter might or something, right? Right, even just, you know, I keep wanting to just take big gobs of paint, and when you're painting this way, you got to be a little bit more patient. You got to you can't just add big blobs of color and smudge it around. You've got to, like, you want to keep the dry brush thing going, right? Even like those brush strokes to me seem like a little bit heavy-handed. Is there any more green? Oh, I see a little bit of green down here. It could just be in the black, but okay. I know there's more green in here, but I think before I just don't want to go too much too quickly. The last thing I want to do is paint my purple, and then I'm going to start going into the black, and then if I need more color, I'm going to put it back in here afterwards. Maria says, "Hi Michael, is there a logic behind the way this artist uses colors? I was looking at some of his artwork and it's so unexpected from my beginner point of view." Good question. Really, I mean, it is interesting that his many of his painting, like like the palette we're using right now with these colors, he used quite frequently. A lot of his colors have this muted brownish kind of quality, which is different than his earlier work. His earlier work had very bright kind of post-impressionist colors, oranges and yellows and baby blues and pinks and stuff, and much more saturated colors. It wouldn't surprise me if this is maybe some of the influence of cubism in his work. in that the cubists, at least the early cubists like Braque and Picasso, and before the kind of the synthetic cubism kind of took over, like Fernand Léger, the early cubists were using very muted palettes, very like browns and grays almost exclusively. And with this kind of pseudo-scientific research kind of approach, and I think, you know, this painting's from 1920. This is this would have been right after he got back from World War I. So, you know, he's probably a little bit affected by what he saw when he was there, and also the effect of cubism, of just seeing that work, and that the browns and grays would have seen, for artists at that time, like that would have been very closely associated with avant-garde painting, and also very classical approaches to painting. Like a lot of Renaissance paintings are brown and gray. So there's sort of this tie to the future and being at the very forefront of the latest art, and also a bit of a callback to the work of the Renaissance painters and beyond, kind of and deliberately skipping over the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, because it's sort of like everyone is always reacting to the previous generation. The previous generation, very, very exuberant, bright colors. So what would a young artist that time do? Well, if my teachers in that generation, they're all using bright colors, okay, we got to use the browns. And then what happens after this? Well, then you have pop artists coming along and who go like, okay, so they're all using dark brown colors, let's use bright colors. And then what happens after? So you can see it seems almost ridiculous when you break it down that way, but that's kind of the history of art, of artists just like being contrarian. And you know, how do you, it's a very simple, like, how do artists stand apart from what's already there and make a name for themselves as well? Doing things differently, and often doing things exactly the opposite of the way that they're supposed to do them. Okay, I want to do my purple next here. So we could get really bright, like, okay, so if let's just mix this right here. If we mix our warm blue and cool red together, we're gonna get a really nice bright purple. It's a really nice saturated purple. If we put this on here right now, though, it's gonna be a little bit intense. I'll put some white in here to show you where I'm looking at. So it's this color right in here. And you can see that's like, whoa, that's a beautiful purple, but a little bit too much. So let's take a bit more blue and put this in here. So we want a little bit more of a blue purple. And again, that's great, but it's still really saturated. So let's take our dark color again. Right? It's like we're adding a tone. Right? Tone is when we add gray to a color. So it's kind of like what I'm doing here. Just trying to get some of that saturation down. And even here, I bet you this is still, it looks pretty muted right now, but I have a feeling, just like all these other colors, once I start painting with it, it's going to look a little bit bright here. Because the white, or the kind of off-white, is sort of invading the color and making it look brighter than it actually is. If I was to paint a big section of this painting using this color, it would not appear to be quite so dark. So let's start over here. Alright, so that's the bottom part. Um, see what I mean? Like it still seems much brighter than I had intended it to be, but that's okay. Now he's this is watercolor, right? But he also did a lot of his paintings in oil paint. So let's just go up here. So another thing he probably would have done is just left his paints out dry and painted with kind of slightly muddy paint or slightly dried paint. And now that I'm painting with this color, I do think he might have painted with this color probably before painting any of the other colors, in retrospect. Because he's using this a lot for kind of like the trunk of the tree and the branches. So I put a big blob down there. I just wanted to smudge it out so it wouldn't be too dark. One thing I would say is dry brush painting is pretty hard on paintbrushes. Like I'm doing a little bit of scrubbing on the surface, and it's basically like the canvas is like kind of almost like a sandpaper when it's rough like that, and scraping your brush all over the surface is not great for the brush, right? So you may not want to use your best brush if it's not already obvious to do this type of thing. So if you've got a really nice brush that you ordered that's $10 or $50, I would use the cheap brush that you got when you were just beginning. almost done with this color, the purple. Okay, so let's zoom back out. You know what's a little bit interesting is there's not a lot, like this is a reflection down here of what we see up here, but the reflection bears very little resemblance to what's above that. And yet this is one of his most famous paintings. So it's interesting to think, like, what is that about? Why did he why is the bottom of this reflection so kind of distorted? Like, what's and I guess I would say he's probably, I mean, in one way, if the water is moving, then we're not going to see the reflection as clearly as if it was a still ice-like surface, right? And you're going to have a perfect reproduction of what you see here down here. But this is, one doesn't get the sense, like, it's called Pink Reflections Bishop's Pond, right? So a pond, I mean, I don't know enough about, like, about water to know all the differences between bodies of water, but when I think of a pond, I think of, like, water that's not necessarily directly connected to a river or an ocean, and therefore might be very still. And yet the reflection is, just like we said, we would expect it to bear a little bit closer resemblance. So what that tells me is he's probably painting this directly from life, sitting maybe on the other side of on the far shore, or the near shore, and that being the far shore, looking across the pond, or sitting on a dock, or maybe in a canoe or a boat of some kind, and he's just painting pretty loosely inspired by what he sees, and he's not super concerned about making a perfect reproduction of nature that is just sort of like he's just painting, really. And, you know, to go back to Maria's question about the logic of the way he uses color, I kind of get the feeling that the logic is, and I don't mean this to put his work down, because again, I said David Milne is probably in my top 10 favorite artists of all time. Huge inspiration. I don't know if, like, obviously I don't think these colors were things that he necessarily saw. I think he probably mixed the colors in advance, had them on his palette, and then just started painting, and maybe looked at what he was painting, like, so he's painting kind of looking, oh, there's a tree, let's get that tree in there, and actually he drew it out first. So I would bet you he sat down with his sketchbook on his knees, perhaps, or this paper on his knees, and drew it out in pencil, and then just started painting almost randomly, maybe looking up every once in a while and being like, okay, there's some lighter colors. I'm going to use the yellow for the lighter colors, the green for the darker foliage, and then, like, I don't think these purples and these blues have any direct relationship to the actual color there. I think he's almost painting much more abstractly and just thinking, okay, I think I like these colors where they are, but do they have necessarily a direct tie to the original? I don't know. So Robbie says, David Milne was born near Port Elgin, about 2 hours drive out north from my home. I usually go camping out there. If you drive further north of Port Elgin, there is a beautiful place called Tobermory. Tobermory. If you're visiting Toronto, you have to go to Tobermory. It's absolutely breathtaking. Yes, the landscape north of Toronto is beautiful. A few years ago, for one of my exhibitions, I went canoeing for a couple of weeks in Algonquin Park and retracing the steps of artist Tom Thompson, and it's incredible. It's I'm Western Canadian. Growing up in Western Canada, you're pretty much raised to hate everything about Toronto and everything around Toronto. So you have like this huge bias to that whole area. Sort of like a lot of Americans who are not from Los Angeles or New York dislike. They just think the world they think that New Yorkers and Los Angelinos believe that the world revolves around their large cities, which in some ways it does. And same sort of thing in Canada. A lot of Canadians hate Toronto because they think all the news, Canadian news, all comes out of Toronto, and which it kind of does. And the same thing in the States. A lot of movies take place in LA or New York. A lot of news is coming out of LA or New York or maybe Washington. So there's a lot of resentment outside of those metropolitan areas. But then if you go spend time in New York, I lived in New York, I also lived in Los Angeles, and I've spent a lot of time in Toronto. You kind of, once you're there, you're like, oh, I you know what? I kind of get it. If you're a Canadian and you spend time in Toronto, you're like, this is a big city. It's and it sounds like kind of obvious, but Toronto is compared to Vancouver, where I live, it's 10 times the size. And so then you kind of go, I kind of get it. I kind of understand why they have this kind of opinion of the rest of Canada being a little bit of like, like a podunk, small town kind of thing, because it does. After you leave Toronto, you're like, yeah, I guess everything is pretty small and outside, right? So, why am I talking about that? I don't know why I'm talking about that. Because I grew up to kind of despise all things Toronto. Probably also because of the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team. And then again, I just lost my train of thought. While I'm thinking about my train of thought, I'm mixing some black paint. This is black paint right out of the tube. Here's my dark color that was almost black, and I'm mixing that in just so it will integrate a little bit better with some of those lines I painted down originally. So now what I'm going to do is really, this is the finishing touches. Possibly, I might need to use some of these colors to go back into it a little bit later. But ideally, I'll just be using this color for the rest of the episode, this dark color. And again, I could just use pure black, but I wanted just a little bit of this original color to help the integration happening.
Really, my first interest in music, and my first taste of music, would be the family single.
Ravi's talking about Tom Thompson and Canoe Lake. So I'm currently working on a graphic novel, a 180-page long comic book, all about the life of Tom Thompson, which will be out in stores, I think, February 2023. So not a few months from now, but over a year from now, just because of publishing.
So he would play all these things, and later on, I took over that role. But that's where I heard all these old songs, you know, Chicago, and I say the great thing
Just wait
was
for that to
because
come
was the
back
entertainment
online.
of that era. It was pre-TV.
Plug the camera in.
So it was great. It all sort of, I took it all in like a sponge.
So yeah, eventually,
And so I grew up, had a great affection for those songs. And I
my book will be
realised
out
that
there
I'd
and you'll be able to read.
been noticing without realizing the structure of the songs and some of the tricks and some of the things that would later find their way into my songs. Because they were in my subconscious.
Well, let's take a look at those points.
So let's start here on the left. I'm just going to slowly work my way to the right, just because that way I don't have to have paint sticking to my hands.
Rocking there.
So I have to be careful not to just launch right in with big, heavy slabs of this black. You gotta build things up,
We moved around a lot.
try to leave gaps in between these colors.
We had a few homes. That was where we ended up.
Did you think of yourselves as, typical British phrases, working class, middle class?
Working class, I thought. John was middle class. John,
Because they had their own house.
yeah, they had their own house. That was a good start for middle classes. We were in a council house. Yeah, I was always very proud.
So in a few places I'm actually putting a little bit of a hard edge line back again
You still do.
that I wasn't able to get with my little
my mind, I think I'm actually very proud to
makeshift brush that I had created, right?
I think people have a strange idea about working class, like they're all thick. My family was like amazingly intelligent. My dad was really a great wordsmith. My cousin Bert used to compile crosswords for Telegraph, Guardian and Times, which are probably three of the best crosswords in the world. So I mean, you know, there were no slouches when it
One
came to that.
thing
So
that I think
was very
he's
proud
doing
of that.
is almost no painting over top of other colors.
They were actually
Now,
quite well read.
that's not what I'm doing
And you said
because
that
I'm still learning his whole technique here.
there was nothing better
But I don't
than
think
common
he really
sense.
layered
The
colors at
Liverpool
all. It's almost
man
every
or
color
man.
Yeah,
is
I
side by
believe that.
side like a puzzle piece or
You know,
something.
I've met, as you say, lots of great people, and I think they are great, but I don't think they're any greater than some of the great people I met as a kid, you know, who were just ordinary people, but had, you know, common sense, had the nous, you know, had the humour, and, you know, had the wit to not become a prime minister. Who needs that, John?
Did the death of your mother interrupt your life? You were only 14.
Oh yeah, it did. It was strange
Kind of
because
simulating
those
that
days,
double
nobody
brush.
talked about it. So we just knew my mum was ill, and we had to go and stay with my auntie. And then just one morning, she came in and just said, "Bad news, boys. You know, your mum's died." And we didn't know of what. We didn't know anything about it. So yeah, it's a huge shock to the system. I suppose you just thought, well, what are we going to do now? You know, what's going to happen? But it's funny, I was talking to a friend the other night, he was saying a lot of people, particularly in the music business,
You know, by the time I finish this painting, I'll have figured it this out, and then
early age and had to sort of pick themselves up and go and do something, or go under. Certainly, that
But, you know,
what gave
that's-
me a big bond with John. That we both lost
That's
our
okay.
lives. He lost his in a particularly terrible accident, and he was very close to his mum as I was to mine.
Work in
So
progress,
we were two Liverpool
learning.
kids growing up who'd lost their mums at an early age.
He was 16, you were 15.
Mm.
So it was early.
It was very early, so we both had this problem to deal with, which sort of, you know, a personal loss. We had the emotional side to deal with, and just the physical side of how we were going to earn some money, because both my parents worked. So yeah, it was very difficult, but it did make me sort of resolve to earn money. I really remember looking around the estate where I lived, and thinking, what's the main problem here? You know, that I'm gonna have to face it, and it was lack of money.
Yeah.
So nobody had money, you know, and they were always arguing. Husband and wife were always, well, you never give me that. Oh, you know, it was always. I thought, if I can avoid that, this would be good. So I think that was kind of one of the big things behind doing the Beatles, as it was for John. You know, just sort of get out
and as you say, earning money. Your first gig, as it were, was at a Butlins camp, was it like?
Yeah, that was a little amateur talent contest.
Says,
we sang Bye Bye Love by the Everly Brothers.
Is there some music playing
in those
here?
days, you didn't get long trousers till you were like about 12 or something.
It could
and
be.
Now, you know, kids have got jeans and everything that aged fine.
Let's
you know,
close that tab.
But it was a thing in our family that, I don't know what they're doing, training your legs or something.
It might have been a video that was playing in the background.
For the future. But, yeah,
Oh, it might have been Paul McCartney. I was watching a bunch of McCartney stuff earlier.
Which looking back on it, I think that was probably my best set of clothes to go to Butlins in. You know, now it would be the kind of the hat thing, the shades, and the iPad.
Yeah.
So yeah, we got up on stage and sang Bye Bye.
Well, you let me know if you still hear it.
No, we never won talent contests. The Beatles never won anything.
I did just finish watching that whole Get Back
ladies playing spoons.
documentary the other day, or was it 2 nights ago?
Yeah.
So I've been fully immersed in Beatles stuff lately. I don't know if anyone else has seen that documentary.
Apart from spin players, your earliest music influences in those days were Elvis, Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard. Those were sort of the names that spring to mind from that part.
Okay. That should have taken care of it. I'm not sure why that video just started up on its own like that. Hopefully it wasn't playing for too long. That would be pretty distracting. Sorry about that. Another thing, too, is that he's painting on paper when he did this painting. And you're going to get a very different effect than when you paint on this canvas. The canvas has got a lot of texture. And that texture can be, it's hard to do dry brush on a little bit of textured canvas like this, and to reproduce some of the sharp lines that we see in his painting. Yeah, I always try to keep you guys on your toes by throwing random things at you and see if there's anybody actually watching. I'm just waiting for one of these days to find out this whole thing has just been like the Truman Show or something. Or not even that, it's like I'm actually in an asylum and it's like, you know, 1925 and everyone's just been like, this guy thinks he's in the year 2020, 2021. He's got his own show on the internet and he's talking to these people and they're sending him pictures and he's talking about their pictures. The guy has completely lost it. It's possible. It's entirely possible. Okay, so I'm just going to zip back up here. Slowly kind of working my way left to right. That way I don't have to worry about my hand dragging over the painting. I'm just thinking about adding a different medium in here to get... I think I'm going to use... Well, I was thinking about using my fluid acrylics, but does it make sense to try to use fluid acrylic? Not really. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my slow dry medium. I haven't used this in a while. I want to get just a little bit sharper lines, and this paint is kind of starting to dry up and seize up a little bit. So the slow dry medium is going to help me get a little bit more fluid lines. It's going to make it a little bit more transparent. It does seem like counterintuitive to try to make the paint more fluid so that I can dry brush with it. But I'm having difficulties getting the kind of lines, like see, now I can get a little bit of a sharper line back in here. So I'm sort of doing a little, almost like a dry brush thing, in that I'm barely allowing the brush to touch the surface of the canvas. Like another view here would be... You can see I'm just barely holding the brush. Right, and just letting it kind of dance over the surface here. I'm sort of holding the brush very loosely, and I'm getting results that I want here. Ravi asks, where can I find the schedule for the next artist? So those are all, it's in the Dropbox, the names of upcoming artists, and and then I post thumbnails for upcoming artists, usually sometimes like the week or two before. But if you look in the Dropbox, you can literally see the templates for all the upcoming artists that are there. Okay, so this is definitely more along the lines of what I wanted to be doing. And in retrospect, maybe I could have been doing this this type of brushwork at the very beginning. So I'm gonna have to the tree on the left here. I'm gonna have to go back and add kind of work it a bit more. But you know, that's what happens. Takes a little while to figure out another artist's style, and even then this is not, you know, I could spend the rest of my life trying to figure this out. So after a while, the paint starts to kind of accumulate on the brush, right? So I'm just gonna wipe it right off. I'm not gonna clean the brush, although after a while you might want to think about doing that, but just to kind of get rid of that big clumpy quality before it actually comes off the brush and onto the surface in a way that I don't want. You know, it's possible. I could see potentially, if you wanted, going back over and painting even some of these lines back out with the color we used for the background that's kind of off-white. I could see painting things out afterwards if you really wanted to. I'm not going to do that, but I could see some people wanting to do something like that. Now again, there's discrepancies between his and mine, right? And even though I used the template to kind of get a relatively accurate composition, I'm totally fine with there being some major differences between his painting and my painting. Just as you should also feel free to take some creative liberties. Don't think of like the art, these artists' work as like a prison. You know, it should be giving you permission to play and explore and try different techniques and as the painting goes on, this accumulation of paint is going to happen more and more and more. The paint's going to get stickier and stickier as time passes, so you know, it's that's just a reality of paint. And so I'm a little, like, all of this detail in here has got me a bit confused. And I'm not exactly sure of the logic of how all of this was done, so I'm just going to do my best to try to capture it. Yeah, it's really hard to not make big, wide lines, especially with this black. Really, the call to big, dark, heavy lines is very attractive. And so there's, you gotta exercise patience. So this looks like either the paint smudging or charcoal blending, maybe a bit of both. So I'm going to put a little bit more of my slow dry medium into my black. Get a bit more of this fluid kind of thing going on. And I'm just, since I'm getting close to the end of this paint, I'm just going to start putting in whatever remaining paint that I have into my black. It's going to be barely noticeable, but I always just want to have a little bit of life in the dark color. Now all of this is like, I am not trying to reproduce everything I see here, right? That would be pretty ridiculous. I'm just trying to give a little bit of the vibe that I see here, with just lots of lines and colors and shapes sort of mishmashing and running into one another. And I am thinking maybe going back over some of the yellow and making it a bit more mustardy than it even was before. So I might come back here once I add a little bit different yellow in that area, then that might change. So I just don't want to overdo it yet. wipe some of this paint off again. Continue. If you can hear our daughter, she's starting to actually run. I mean, fast walking, I think, is maybe closer to the way it might appear to the majority of us, but it's pretty funny, pretty adorable, and then also you're like, wow, that's gonna be in a short amount of time. I'm literally going to be running after her while she tries to run out into the street or after a dog, or you're like, everything as a parent sort of just gets exciting, and then you're like, oh no, like, and then at some point she's going to be able to outrun me. So there's that brief moment of where everything's really exciting, just like she's into everything, into drawers and cabinets, and can, you know, so again, I'm being very careful not to overdo this. Like, I almost feel like I've done that already, overdone it a bit. So I like how, let's zoom back out. And okay. So those black areas definitely stand out pretty intensely, but I think all this kind of line work that I did here, I want to see a bit more of it on this side. And so I'm going to use my slow dry medium again. The one thing is that I keep adding more and more slow dry medium into this paint, and it's making it more and more transparent. So that's why I'm taking this black, even I'm just throw this big glob of yellow in here. The black is going to destroy that yellow, so I don't have to worry about that. Actually, I'm just going to get a different brush for this mixing. Just use our brush that we chopped up. So by adding that yellow in here, even though it's not the quote-unquote correct color, the black has destroyed that yellow completely, right? And now I've got a little bit more of an opaque color again that's not quite so transparent. In fact, I'm just going to put a bit more slow dry medium in here again. Let's use a bigger brush to stir that in. I mean, it's definitely kind of turning this color a little bit brownish, but it's going to be so subtle then. So, let's... So even that already kind of helps get just that bit more sharper lines. Right, that made a huge improvement, at least as far as I'm concerned. Not exactly, you know, there's obviously some discrepancies. So I'm not hardly really honestly looking at the original at this state or time, because now I'm just sort of going and refining some of my own lines. If you haven't seen that Beatles documentary, I do recommend it. It is, I don't know if anyone else has seen it, Get Back. Really well done. I mean, I'm a bit of a Beatles fan, so I'm pretty familiar with the story, and I could see some people who are not as big a Beatles fans finding it a bit tedious at times. It's 9 hours long. But you know, I do watch, you know, my wife and I watch like Netflix and stuff all the time, and there's definitely lots of stuff that we watch that I don't even remember. I don't remember what was the story or the actors, and it's like before I know it, we're watching season 3 of some random show, and so the fact that, like, you know, spending 9 hours with the Beatles is, you know, there's worse things one could do, right? So I'm going to look at the signature here. Now, he signed his much smaller. I've enlarged it significantly. In fact, so what is his middle name? Is it? Oh, I close that tab. David Brown. So that is a B. So I think this is a 20. I'm going to turn it to 1920. So this is like 20. I'm just going to... So now I'm going to just darken things. I think I'm going to change that yellow now. So just clean a few brushes. Actually, that document, what you heard was an interview with Robert Frost, who was I think he's still alive, is an interviewer, probably most famous for interviewing Richard Nixon, the Frost versus Nixon. It was a interview back in the late 70s. And he was interviewing Paul McCartney probably like 10 years ago. So that's not actually from the Peter Jackson documentary. Oh, what was I going to do? Or the yellow. Taking this yellow, making it a little bit less intense. So, what colors can I use here that... Because we can modify any color in all sorts of different ways. We take our yellow. Let's put it down here. Let's bring a bit of purple into this color. It goes kind of green. You can see here's the previous version of it. Let's take a bit of red to keep it in the brown family. Take a bit of my darker color. Mix this in there. That's a little bit too dark now. Although maybe not too far off. That's definitely going to be a darker mustardy color. Yeah, I think that might be okay. So let's try that. Yeah, that's the color I want. So, you know, you never really know until... I mean, I did, you know, earlier on I thought, well, I might need to darken that. But I'm happy that I waited, because it would have been awful if I had just gone and tried to fix it earlier on before I knew what really needed to be done here. So I don't want to put too much of this down here. Just gotta be careful not to overdo it. I'm so happy that I'm doing this, because it's really kind of tying, I think, the colors back together much better. A little bit less of that yellow, which was kind of mustardy and not the most pleasant looking yellow, but when it was on the canvas it looked really bright. It looked... because colors are always relative to the other colors they're next to. And if you put you know, a color that might otherwise not look that bright next to a bunch of darker colors, all of a sudden that color looks really bright. So Like you can see, that doesn't seem to be that bright. But, you know, I mean, it seems right here, but it's certainly, if you remember, that color was modified and darkened significantly. Okay. That feels much better. And it's, well, I don't know, we'll see how well that shows up on camera. But here, it's made a huge improvement. So just the green, I think. Do I need to do, I might do a little bit more green. I still have some green left over. It's pretty sticky at this point. I won't need much of it. Just take my dark, actually that was black. Just mix that in here so we get a bit of an even darker green. Bit much. Let's take a bit of yellow back in here. Lighten it up just a bit because it was kind of dark. And it's kind of sticky paint. It's okay. Let's zoom in. Lolly's got to go to bed. I totally understand. Right, even here this just seems really bright, but okay. I'm getting pretty close, if not done, but let's just side by side. Maybe that needs to be a bit darker. Down here. I'm not even going to bother washing my brush, because I don't think he would have either, but just dipping into this dark paint. And so it's this is usually my favorite part of making a painting, is the last marks here where I can kind of take my time, decide precisely where I want things to go. Am I done here? I see an area. Okay. So I think I'm pretty happy walking away at this point. I don't think it's going to get that much better, and I'm afraid of getting too much darker. So it's the 21st. Oh my goodness. So it's, I can't remember, 100, no, is it 68? I think he died 68 years ago. I could be on the 26th of December. What's pretty funny is this painting is called Pink Reflections. And I don't know about you, but I don't really see any pink in the painting, especially not in the reflections. It's, Okay, before I go, I'm kind of curious. Now I'm just like, where is Bishop's Pond? Just gotta look up. Ah, I'm typing. Bishop's Pond. Wales. Oops. It's New York. Okay, that must be. Oh, it's a condominium complex. Huh. I don't think that's... I think it's somewhere near where he was living in Boston Corner here. Somewhere in that area. Just out of curiosity, I thought it was... So... let's just... I want to put these... side by side as we just thinking about wrapping up here. Got a little bit more yellow in here than he did. It's tricky to have that much restraint in a painting, that's for sure. It's so much fun to try a technique like that. I've been a super fan of David Milne since, I don't know, one of the first times I saw his work. It just connected with me. How he allows so much empty space to stay in his paintings. The only other artist I can think of that really allowed that to happen is Henri Matisse, the French artist and rival of Picasso. Matisse often left areas of the painting blank and empty, but for the most part, artists go out of their way to fill everything up. And I do think, again, you know, that's something we see a lot more in Chinese and Japanese, Korean art is including the paper or the canvas as part of the painting. Like the empty areas aren't just blank spaces that need to be filled in, but they are shapes in and of themselves, and using them as colors I think it's fascinating. And I don't know enough about David Milne and his technique to know what inspired that approach, but it's something it is always connected deeply with me. And the fact that he is such a unique figure that no one else, it's not like there were other people who were doing similar things to him while he was doing it. He was off on his own, doing his own thing. And to this day, I don't know that many artists that paint in a way anywhere near that he's done. So that's what makes him such a unique character, and why I've always found him so inspiring, is because my own career has definitely gone in its own direction. So, anyway. Pascal says Bishop's Pond in Newfoundland? I don't think he ever went to Newfoundland. I mean, I could be wrong, but I certainly don't think this painting was made in Newfoundland. So I don't know. I mean, at this time, I think he's back in northern New York State. So I don't know. If you know exactly where today's painting was, please let me know in the comments for this video, because we probably won't find out for a little while. Maybe if I called up the National Gallery, they would tell me, but that's for another conversation sometime in the future. Okay, so On Thursday, we are going to be painting Robert Indiana's famous Love painting. He did that many, many times. It looks awesome. I'm a huge fan of Robert Indiana as well. So it's going to be fun looking at that painting. It's going to be a beautiful, kind of perfect painting for the Christmas time, right? Christmas is all about family and love. So I think that's one of the reasons why I chose it for this period of time. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and wherever you are on our beautiful planet Earth, thanks for tuning in and for watching. Please upload your version of today's painting to the Facebook group so that we can see the incredible things that you've been working on during this time. If you want to support the channel, please hit like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you find out when the next video is coming up. I'm going to be doing some random videos over the holidays. So, and if you want to support the channel with your contribution as a small donation, as little as $1, there's the super chat here in YouTube. There's also, you can send a check or e-transfer by contacting me through my email or through the Facebook group, and there's a PayPal link in the description below. Pascal says, creation date 24th of August 1920, Boston Corners. There you go. Thanks, Pascal. Okay, everyone, enjoy the rest of your evening. We'll see you guys again very, very soon. And yeah. Good night, everybody.